This is David's response to being hemmed in, weary of the attack of the enemy. We read the story in 1 Samuel and we see and understand how that would wear him down as he sought to live for the Lord, as he sought to serve God's purposes. But it strikes us that God's warrior is afraid. God's warrior is afraid. And as soon as I began to read that and think about that, I thought, maybe I'm having some wrong thoughts about fear. Maybe I'm assuming some things about fear. And I was just asking Greg before the afternoon service, you think that Adam and Eve should have feared eating that fruit? Because they didn't. When God came walking in the cool of the evening, they were afraid. And so in looking at this, I thought we probably ought to spend some afternoons just thinking a little more about this, make sure we're thinking right. I was sharing this morning that I remember a man taking exception with me 11 or 12 years ago because I was teaching that the fear of the Lord is something that should be part of our lives, and I countered the idea that when you learn to love the Lord, you no longer fear the Lord. I think Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 counters that immediately because they did not fear the Lord, because they didn't reverence the Lord. They took of the fruit. And then there was fear that came as a result of that. I think when you read through the book of Revelation, there is reason for fear in those that rebel against the Lord is because he's going to cast them out of his presence for eternity. And so if there's anybody that's a no-fear person, it's Lucifer, right? It's Satan, no fear. This contradiction that took place a couple of years ago where everybody was posting, it's about faith, not fear. That's a misunderstanding. That's a misrepresentation, as if fear is somehow opposed to faith. I know how we get there, and I know what goes on inside of us to think, well, I'm a person of faith and not a person of fear. I suggest to you that David was a man of faith who also was at times a man of fear. I would say Jesus in the garden was fearing, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? He was fearing the fury of sin, the fury of our payment on that cross. And so I wanted to take some time to think about application of these things and make sure that we're thinking right and be encouraged personally to think through this right. So Psalm number 56, you see that long word to the chief musician upon. I tried to pronounce that this morning. Let's break it down into its three parts. Jonath, there is a dove. Okay, that's what that word means, a dove. And a dove is a favorite emblem of suffering, innocence, those that are innocent and suffering. A dove is an apt picture of that, a favorite picture of that. So Jonath is a dove. And then Elam, E-L-E-M, means simply silence. Silence. And in this case, we would say it's an uncompromising submission. David in an uncompromising submission before the Lord. So Jonath is a dove, Elam is silence or uncomplaining submission, and Rechokim, R-E-C-H-O-K-I-M, really is a word that simply means distant or remote. So David is away from Jerusalem. He's among strangers. He's suffering. He's innocent and he's suffering. And he is in uncomplaining submission to the Lord. And I mean the complaining in the negative sense. He's suffering though he's innocent. He's submitting to the Lord, and he's in a distant place. I would say of David, and I think you saw this in 1 Samuel, he's alone, and he's afraid. And he is at the same time aware of who God is. It's a miktam of David. It's instructive. It's a teaching psalm. What is it? Well, the first two verses are really an earnest prayer. Let's look at it again. Here's an earnest prayer, and I want to incorporate this into my life. And one of our thoughts over the last number of years is teaching us how to use the Psalms personally. So the first two verses, there is an earnest prayer. Be merciful unto me, O God, for man would swallow me up. His fighting daily oppresseth me. Mine enemies would daily swallow me up. That the word there, Hebrew word there, has to do with a panting, a breathing. The idea is they're behind me and they're trying to swallow me up. For they be many, it's not just one, they be many that fight against me. David is feeling very alone, and he's going to the Most High. So verses 1 and 2 is an earnest prayer. He's being chased in hot pursuit. He's threatened. Verses 3 and 4 is an expression of trust. An expression of trust follows this earnest prayer. This is a deliberate choice, and I think this is important for us to understand. Faith involves action. It involves the will. This is a choice on David's part. What time I am afraid, here's what I'm going to do. My response to that fear is, I will trust in thee. In God, I will praise his word. I'll turn my focus to what God's word reveals about himself. In God, I have put my trust. I will rest in what God has promised. I'll rest in who God is. And then last of verse 4, I will not fear what flesh can do unto me. You can appreciate the process there, can't you? He said, this is what I'm going to do. When I'm afraid, I'm going to trust in you. I'm going to focus on your word, your promises. I'm going to focus on who you are. I'm going to refresh my soul in that reality. I'm going to trust in you, and thus I'm not going to fear what flesh can do unto me. Verses 1 and 2 is an earnest prayer. Verses 3 and 4 is an expression of trust. Verses 5 and 6 is a description of his enemies. A description of his enemies. We know Paul encountered the same thing. Those that were speaking against him. In verse 5, every day they wrest my words. And we don't really know what kind of conversation was happening, do we? But we do know that there was a great challenge because God had said to Saul, I'm going to replace you with a man that has my heart, with a man that's a neighbor that's better than you are. And so we can imagine Saul's taken offense to that, and Saul is energized by that. He's envious, he's jealous, and no doubt that spread to those around Saul, those that were actually pursuing David. He said every day, continually, without fail, what do? They wrest my words. I think that's beautiful language, and I think we understand that. They twist. They pervert. Have you ever had that happen to you? Somebody takes something that you said, and they twist it, right? They pervert it, and it comes out saying something you didn't say at all, right? Something that, and verbal attacks are very, very painful. They're very damaging. And I think when we have a heart after the Lord, our greatest concern is his glory. If we're his people or we're seeking to represent him, I think we see that in Paul. I think his concern is not himself in some kind of self-defense, but because of who he is in serving the Lord. When people were wresting his words, when people were attacking Paul, they were diminishing, right? They were diminishing Paul as the apostle. Every day, David says, they wrest my words. All their thoughts are against me for evil. The way they're thinking, the imaginations of their thoughts are only evil continually. David says they're against me. Verse 6, they gather themselves together. They hide themselves. They mark my steps when they wait for my soul. An earnest prayer, verses 1 and 2, an expression of trust, verses 3 and 4. And I can follow that. I can think about that. What do I do? How does David instruct me here? What do I do when I'm full of fear? What do I do when I wake up in fear? Earnest prayer, verses 3 and 4, an expression of trust, verses 5 and 6. There is that communion with the Lord, right? As he describes his enemies, he talks to the Lord about what's going on. He confides in the Lord. Let me encourage you, that's our first place to confide. I think that this is a lesson that maybe we would all agree with, but we don't necessarily practice. Folks, our need is not to go to another person. Our need is to go first and foremost to the Lord. And I think when we don't think that way, we end up in this in a misunderstood perspective of how we are to deal with things, how we're to deal with hardship or deal with fear. Why don't we talk it out with the Lord? Why don't we talk it out with the Lord? The corrupt communication that we've been talking about on Wednesday nights, we have to be very careful because sometimes we just drag another person down into our fears. We don't do them any good. And is God big enough to deal with our fears without me spreading that to other people? And I'm not meaning that we don't sometimes need some counsel, need some help. I'm just suggesting to you that what David is doing here is he talks about his enemies. He's talking about his enemies with the Lord instead of with somebody else. And then verses 7 through 9, We could add to that a confident hope. A confident hope. Verses 7 through 9, shall they escape by iniquities? They know God's a just God. They're certainly not going to get away with this. Lord, in thine anger, cast down the people, O God. Thou tellest my wanderings. Lord, you're completely aware. You're watching me. You know why I'm down here. You know how I got down here. Put thou my tears into thy bottle. Lord, as you're communing with me, you're seeing the weeping. Put them in your bottle. Are they not in thy book? You're certainly aware of these things. When I cry unto thee, then shall mine enemies turn back. And he knows this, and he needs to say this to the Lord, and we need to say this to the Lord. This I know, for God is for me. God is for me. When I'm walking with him, when I'm seeking to serve him, I need to be reminded of that. The accuser is telling me God's not for me, right? The accuser is telling me God is not on my side. The accuser is telling me that the reason I'm suffering these things is because of something I've done, even if it's not something I've done. He's the accuser of the brethren. This is what he does because he wants to destroy us. And then verses 10 through 13, there's a commitment to praise. In God will I praise his word. In the Lord will I praise his word, his promises. In God will I put my trust. I will not be afraid what man can do unto me. Thy vows are upon me, O God. I will render praises unto thee. Lord, I've vowed to you. I've committed to you. I will render praise to you. For thou hast delivered my soul from death. Even though, he could be referring to something in the past, but presently he's still in the midst of this life-threatening situation. Thou hast delivered my soul from death. Wilt not thou deliver my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of the living. He wanted to remain before the Lord, walking before the Lord and serving the Lord. I want to think about this for just a few minutes this afternoon under the title of Facing Our Fears. Facing our fears. I was trying to think about the other options that we might be prone to move into. And I've got 4 of those before you. Options before us. First of all, in dealing with our fears and facing our fears, taking them into our own hands. These fears, these things that trouble us. Now we're going to fix them externally. We're going to work these things out. We're going to protect ourselves against any harm, taking them into our own hands versus taking them to the Lord in prayer. And I think this would resonate with most of us, that we have a tendency when we have a fear of something that we're going to do something to make sure that we fix that so we don't need to fear that anymore. That's the idea of taking it into our own hands versus taking them to the Lord in prayer. What I'm talking about here, you'll see that second line, is trusting his promises. I will praise his word. I praise his word, he says in verse 10 twice. Trusting his promises and his heart toward us. Trusting his promises and his heart toward us. Folks, we need to stop long enough to recognize that God works through these things. It's not necessarily that he doesn't want us to be in this hardship. It's certainly not that he wants us to circumvent what he's doing and somehow answer everything and fix everything. I'm going to do this and this and this and this, and all this is going to be in place so I don't have any fear anymore. We take those things into our own hands, and we fail to trust the Lord, to trust his promises, but also to trust his heart toward us. One thing we learned from David, maybe as much as anything in the Psalms, is that he trusts God's heart. He knows God. The shepherd boy communing with God on the hillside, whatever all of the situations have been, he trusts the Lord. He trusts his promises. That's a faith response, isn't it? That is a faith response. Trusting his promises and his heart toward us. A second option is allowing them to dictate our steps, these shifts in the road that we tend to make, versus choosing to prioritize our spiritual welfare. Another option before us as we face our fears is allowing them, those fears, to dictate our steps. So we do what we do out of fear. versus choosing to prioritize our spiritual welfare, to say, whatever God has for me, I know the primary thing he has for me is to walk with him. The primary thing he has for me is to transform who I am, to change me from glory to glory. And that may not include changing all the circumstances. That may not include something changing in my life at this point in time. So to allow those fears to dictate our steps seems a human answer. The other would be to choose to prioritize our spiritual welfare, maintaining our commitment to him. The line there, maintaining our commitment to him and his purposes. My efforts here is just to try to get you to engage your mind on these issues of fear and faith, to try to think with you what our tendencies might be, to try to take what David has said here and to move it across and bring it into our own lives. I can let those fears dictate my steps, or I can choose to prioritize my spiritual welfare and to make sure that my walk with the Lord, my exposure to his word, my day-to-day practices prioritize my spiritual relationship with him. So I put down here, maintaining our commitment to him and his purposes. I don't think we've been very good examples of this as pastors. I have been in pastor fellowships over the years. I went in graduate school and I was with 65 or 70 men all week, twice a year. And so you had class time, but you also had time in the evenings, you had time in the afternoons, you had time of exchange. And what happens to all of us is we live in a culture, we begin to think like that culture, and then we begin to bat back and forth the situations and challenges. Pastors are more tendent to talk to other pastors about ministry. And I tended to be the guy in the corner just listening to what was going on, how men were talking. I realized in those conversations and listening to, well, what do you think I should do about this? Pastors tend to be very pragmatic about that. Whether it be leaving a ministry or whether it be addressing a situation, we have in us the same thing you have in you. And so our tendency is we're going to fix that, or here's God's will. We're having problems with our church, so it's God's will for me to move along now. You don't know how many times I have heard from pastors saying, I've led this church as far as I can lead it, and God's calling me somewhere else. Well, see, the problem with that for me is I know where they heard that because I heard the same things as long as I've been pastoring. It's kind of like, oh, okay, you're having trouble. That's what you really mean, right? Are you willing to stay through the trouble? Are you willing to leave if God calls you somewhere else when there isn't trouble? See, we're just as pragmatic. We're the same stuff. We're the same flesh. And so to think that out and to recognize that, doubts and fears can end up driving us. And we begin to make decisions, and those decisions are not based upon our spiritual welfare. They're based upon pieces and parts of life. And practically, we've come to this conclusion. We've reasoned our way to this place. And maybe the reason we have to say it so much is because we're trying to convince ourselves that we're doing the right thing. Instead of just be still, right? Where's David? He's being still. He's waiting. He's waiting to see what the Lord has. And he's asking the Lord. He's trusting the Lord. Thirdly, another option would be reacting in antagonism and attack. Reacting in antagonism and attack versus leaving the judgment and outcome to the Lord. So we basically rant, we basically sever relationships, we basically hurt those that are hurting us, or in this case of Saul, reacting in antagonism and attack is an option. But the other option, the better option, I think the David option here is leaving the judgment and outcome to the Lord. That involves resting in his righteousness and his right to rule. His right to rule. Does God have the right to rule my life? Is he Lord over my life? Yes. Is he righteous? Yes. Will he ever do anything that's unrighteous? No. Will he ever do anything that's not right? No. So for me to react in antagonism and attack versus leaving the judgment and the outcome to the Lord would be the wrong thing to do. I need to rest in His righteousness and right to rule. Sometime when you're taking something like this application, just take it and put it in your own mind beside the person of Christ. And ask yourself honestly how Christ responded. Because that's what we're doing, and we're being conformed to the image of Christ. So you watch what was said about Christ, you watch what was done to Christ, you watch the situation and circumstance that Christ found himself in, and you listen to Christ. You hear the heart of Christ, you watch the Spirit of Christ, and you say, there it is. That is where I should be. That's how I should be responding. So facing our fears, David says, this I know, for God is for me. Options before us, taking them into our own hands, right? I'm going to fix this. Or taking them to the Lord in prayer. Trusting His promises and His heart toward us. Secondly, allowing them to dictate our steps versus choosing to prioritize our spiritual welfare. We start making decisions that hamper us and hurt us spiritually because we're going to fix something. That's wrong. That has to do with maintaining our commitment to Him and His purposes. Thirdly, reacting to antagonism and attack. And we're like anyone else. We have the capacity to think, well, they deserve that. They deserve what I said to them. They deserve what I did to them. They deserve what I said about them. Reacting to antagonism and attack versus leaving the judgment and the outcome to the Lord. Resting in His righteousness and right to rule. See, this has a lot to do with saturating our hearts and minds with who God is. Because if you don't know His righteousness, if you don't understand His right to rule, if you don't trust Him, you won't rest. I won't rest. The fourth option will be turning inward in self-pity. Folks, we are by nature self-centered. And when we are dealing with fear and doubt and hardship, very easy for you and me to become the orb of everything. We're at the center. And you listen to yourself and you'll hear that the way you approach life and the way that you think is starting with you instead of with God. And I think hardship and illness and doubt and difficulty and fear fuel that and also bring that to light. Turning inward in self-pity and isolation. So everything in life now has to do with my fear and my situation and my doubt and my hardship. That's an empty way to live life. It's an empty way to live life versus anticipating God's intervention. We need to know that God has actually intervened, anticipating God's intervention with thanksgiving praise. You heard that in the closing verses of David's psalm. He's anticipating God's intervention with thanksgiving praise. We need to see God at work in our lives. And if that's going to be the case, then we have to turn away from this idea of living in self-pity and isolation, because all of life now is measured in the hub of my hardship and my difficulty and my challenge. So the last thing here would be viewing each situation as an opportunity to glorify God. Viewing each situation as an opportunity to glorify God and to grow. To glorify God and to grow, viewing each situation as an opportunity to glorify God and grow. Fear is not a bad thing, okay? And I think we'll prove that to you over a couple of weeks. Fear is not a bad thing. Fear is something God built into us. It's a natural part of our makeup. Not fearing God. So it got Adam and Eve into the place where they feared for God to come walk in the garden, right? Not fearing God is what causes nations to rise up against God, Psalm number 2, and say, He's not going to rule over us. Not fearing God is what causes the young man in Proverbs to go down that street that his dad told him, don't go down that street, right? And so as we think about issues of fear and as we think about issues of faith, I hope we'll be able to see these things come together. And in the end, I hope we'll be able to see that when we fear the Lord, as the Bible teaches us to, that's the offset, isn't it? For this sinful fear, or this fear that would be harmful to us.